The finalization came through at 9:52 on a Wednesday morning, and I know that because I had been staring at the second hand on the courtroom clock for so long that I'd memorized the way it stuttered just before the 12. 7 years of marriage ended with a signature and a gavel and a judge saying, "Divorce granted," in the same tone someone might use to confirm a lunch reservation. My name is Tabitha, and I'm 34 years old. I'm a licensed CPA. I grew up in Greensboro, moved to Charlotte for work at 26, and spent the last 7 years trying to be the kind of wife my mother-in-law could approve of, which I eventually understood was an impossible standard that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with the particular story she needed to tell about her family. My husband sat at his own table that morning with his attorney and did not once look in my direction. That was fine. I had stopped looking to him for things a long time before that morning. When my attorney squeezed my arm and said, "It's done, Tabitha," I felt something unhook in my chest that I hadn't realized was clamped shut. The settlement had been negotiated over the preceding 3 months. The house in Dilworth, the one we'd bought together, the one his mother had immediately started treating like a Styles family property, despite the fact that the down payment came equally from both our savings, would be listed immediately, with proceeds split 60-40 in my favor to account for documented contributions to the marital estate. That included the $200,000 I had invested directly into Styles Development Group 5 years earlier in exchange for a 35% membership interest in the family LLC. That detail was about to matter quite a lot. I had one errand before I drove home. It should have taken 15 minutes. I needed to retrieve a small pair of pearl earrings from the top drawer of the guest room dresser at the Dilworth house. Earrings that had belonged to my grandmother, that I'd left there during a stretch when I was sleeping in the guest room to put some air between myself and my husband. Sometime around month 4 of our separation, they were worth nothing in dollar terms. The gold posts were worn thin on one side from decades of use. But they were the last physical thing I had of hers, and I was not leaving Charlotte without them. I knew my mother-in-law might be there. She'd been spending more time at the house since I'd filed, which I had always read as slightly strategic. A way of occupying the space before I could clear it out, of planting herself in the narrative so that the house felt more like hers than it ever legally had been. I had braced myself for the familiar version of her. Composed, pointed, operating in that register she had mastered where each comment was technically polite and actually a small blade. Something like, "I do hope you find what you're looking for." That kind of thing. What I had not anticipated was what met me when I pulled into the driveway at 11:20 that morning. She was on the front steps before I even cut the engine. By the time I got out of the car, she had already moved to the base of the steps, positioning herself between me and the door, with the rigid posture of someone who had choreographed this in advance. She was wearing her cream blazer, the one she brought out for what she called important occasions, which included, apparently, this. Her arms were crossed tight. "You need to leave," she said, controlled but only just. "You don't live here. This isn't your property." "I just need to get something from inside," I said. 5 minutes. "There is nothing in that house that belongs to you." Her voice climbed a half note. "Conrad said you cleared your things. I'm asking you to leave." That was a lie. My husband knew about the earrings. I had texted him twice during the separation asking about them. He had responded both times with, "I'll look into it," which was how he handled most things, the verbal version of closing a browser tab. I took a step toward the stairs. "Get out," she said at once, and then again, louder the second time, and on the third repetition it was barely below a shout, cutting through the quiet of an ordinary Wednesday neighborhood morning. "Get out of my house. You were never supposed to be here. Get out." Across the street, a neighbor glanced up from her garden. 2 houses down, a man paused on the sidewalk with his dog. I stood at the base of those steps and I looked at my mother-in-law, and I noticed something happening inside me that I hadn't expected. Not the familiar shrinking, not the urge to smooth things over, to apologize for taking up space, to manage her reaction the way I had managed it 100 times across 7 years of holiday dinners and family gatherings, where I'd worn the right clothes and said the careful things, and smiled at comments that were designed to remind me I did not quite belong. Not any of that. What I felt was stillness, the particular kind that comes not from detachment, but from knowing something the other person doesn't know yet. I waited until she was finished, until the last syllable had settled and the neighbors had moved on, and the air between us had gone quiet. Then I said softly, "I understand. I'll get out of your way." And then I said, "I should probably mention though, the listing agent signed the purchase contract on this house at 7:45 this morning. The offer came in last Tuesday over asking price. The buyers are waiving inspection. We close in 40 days. I watched the first thing move across her face, the incomprehension, the kind where the brain encounters a statement it is not yet equipped to process and simply stalls. And yesterday afternoon, I continued, keeping my voice the way you keep a candle in a draft. Low, steady, very deliberate. The LLC membership voted to remove Conrad as managing member. The vote was 65 to 35. I voted against the removal. The other 65% was Clifton's trust and the advisory member combined. That was enough under the operating agreement. The change that moved through her after that was not a single expression. It was a sequence. Incomprehension first, then the slow arrival of understanding, and then something I had genuinely never seen on her face in the entire time I had known her. A fear that had nothing to do with me, and everything to do with the discovery that the floor she had been standing on was not made of what she thought. Her arms dropped from across her chest. "That's not possible," she said. The authority was already draining out of her voice like water leaving a bathtub. "Conrad runs the LLC. He's been running it for 6 years," I said. "Yes, and in those 6 years, the LLC's 2 largest development projects came in significantly over budget. One Opportunity Zone fund lost its 2 anchor investors, and an internal audit commissioned last October identified $380,000 in unauthorized disbursements routed through an account that was never disclosed to the other members." She reached out and gripped the iron railing at the side of the steps. I watched her hand close around it. "Clifton's trust has held a 30% interest since Conrad's father passed," I continued. "He has been calling for a financial review for 2 years. He and I are the ones who finally moved to commission it through an independent firm. When the results came back, the operating agreement was clear about what qualified as material breach and what the remedy was." "He still has his membership interest," she said. Her voice had gone so quiet that the neighborhood sounds, a car passing, someone's AC unit cycling on, were suddenly audible around it. "He does," I agreed. "What he does with it now is between him and an attorney." I took a step back toward my car. "I'm going to contact the listing agent and ask for access to the guest room this afternoon," I said. "I left something there that belongs to me. My grandmother's earrings. They're in the top dresser drawer. Once I have them, I won't have any reason to come back here." I turned around. I did not look back. I sat in the car for a moment at the end of the driveway, texted my attorney to coordinate with the listing agent, and pulled out onto the street. 24 minutes later, on 277 heading north, my phone rang. I let it ring 3 times before I answered. Tabitha. My husband's voice was something I had not heard before, stripped of the layer he usually kept over everything, the practiced composure he used in client meetings, and the slightly distant register he'd been using with me since the separation. This was underneath all of that. "My mother just called me." She could barely get through a full sentence. "What did you tell her?" "The truth," I said. "About the house and about the vote." A silence. "The vote isn't." He stopped, started again. "Clifton doesn't have unilateral authority. The operating agreement requires a simple majority for removal in cases of material breach," I said. Section 7.4. Which you and I both signed in 2019, along with Clifton and the advisory member. Unauthorized disbursements of $380,000 routed through an undisclosed account over 28 months meets the definition of material breach as specified in Section 7.4 DAB. The audit documentation is thorough. 3 independent CPAs reviewed the findings. Another silence, longer. "You went to Clifton," he said, and his voice had shifted now, the panic finding an edge, becoming something accusatory. "During our marriage. You went behind my back to my own uncle." "I went to Clifton in October," I said. 3 months after I filed and 4 months after I first identified the disbursement account during a quarterly review. "I didn't go behind your back. I exercised the rights I've had as a 35% member since 2019, including the right to request a financial audit. The operating agreement spells out that process in Section 11.2. The audit was conducted by a licensed firm. The results are a matter of LLC record." "This is about the divorce," he said. "You're doing this to punish me." I thought, briefly, about what it would feel like to tell him that no, this had nothing to do with punishment. which was the truth, but which he was not currently capable of receiving. I thought about how many times in 7 years I had shaped what I said to make it easier for him to hear. There are 14 people employed by Styles Development, I said instead. There's a mixed-use project in Noda that breaks ground in 12 weeks. Some of those employees have been with that company since your father was running it. What I did for the LLC. I tried 3 times in the last 2 years to bring the financial irregularities to your attention, directly, before I went to anyone else. You told me the accounts were fine. They were not fine. He started to say something. I heard him forming it, the beginning of an argument or a plea. I wasn't entirely sure which. And I said, calmly, talk to an attorney. There's a transition process in place. Clifton is managing it fairly. And I ended the call. I drove the rest of the way with the windows down. Charlotte in July is not a windows down kind of city, but that afternoon I needed the air. At 4 o'clock, the listing agent's assistant met me at the Dilworth house. The driveway was empty. Inside, the house felt different, not in any physical way, just in the way that a space feels different when the power dynamic that always defined your experience of it has shifted. I walked to the guest room and opened the top drawer of the dresser, and there they were, exactly where I'd left them. The small silk pouch, slightly wrinkled, with the 2 pearl earrings inside. I held them in my palm for a moment, standing in the middle of that room in a house that would belong to someone else by September. And I thought about my grandmother, who had worn these earrings to every occasion that mattered to her, and several that didn't, and I thought about how small and solid and completely irreplaceable they were. I put them in my jacket pocket, thanked the assistant, and walked out without looking back at the room. That evening, I met Kezia at a restaurant in Uptown we'd been going to, since we were both junior staff at the same accounting firm, back when our biggest professional problems were navigating the busy season and figuring out whether to split a cab home. She had been the one who connected me with the audit firm in October, after I showed her the disbursement records I'd found during a quarterly review of the LLC's filings. She had been thorough and methodical in a way that I hadn't had the bandwidth to be while simultaneously managing a divorce, and she was the only person who had known the full picture from the beginning. She pushed a folder across the table before she picked up her menu. Clifton wants to offer you the interim managing member role, she said, while they conduct a formal search. I'm quoting him directly here. She's the only one in this situation who has actually read the whole operating agreement and understood what it said. I opened the folder. Inside was a transition summary, a proposed scope of interim authority, and a compensation structure that was, I noted, substantially higher than the management fee my husband had been drawing for the past 6 years. I thought about the Tuesday in 2021, when I had written a check for $200,000 and handed it across a conference table to the LLC's attorney. I had run the numbers myself over the preceding 2 months, analyzed the balance sheets, modeled the project pipelines, stress-tested the cash flow assumptions against 3 different market scenarios. I had believed in what Conrad's father had built. I had also believed at that point that my investment in the business and my investment in the marriage were part of the same coherent thing. They weren't. I found that out gradually, and then in the way you find most things out that you've been postponing, all at once. The 35% interest stays either way, I said. That's not conditioned on the interim role. Not conditioned, Kezia confirmed. That's yours outright. The offer is additive. I looked at the folder for a moment, thinking about Lavinia on those steps that morning. I thought about 7 years of dinner tables where I had been managed and navigated, and quietly made to feel like a draft that everyone was tolerating, rather than a person who had earned her seat. I thought about how I had kept shrinking myself, degree by degree, until the shrinking had started to feel like just who I was. Tell Clifton yes, I said, on the condition that everything runs transparent from day one. Full member reporting, all accounts disclosed, no off-book arrangements of any kind. If I'm stepping in, it operates clean. Kezia's expression didn't quite become a smile, but it got there. He said you'd say that. And? He said, good, that is exactly what this company needs. I drove home that night on the same streets I'd driven for 7 years. Past the coffee shop where I used to take my laptop on Saturday mornings. Past the park where I walked during the first months of the separation when I couldn't sit still in my apartment. Past the whole geography of a life I had lived inside and was now living differently. The Dilworth house was dark when I drove past it. The for sale sign was already planted in the front yard, bright white with the listing agent's name in blue across the bottom. In 40 days, other people would begin the process of making it theirs. Learning its particular rhythms, putting their own things in its cabinets, making it the background of a life that had nothing to do with me. That was completely fine. That was exactly as it should be. There is something that doesn't get said often enough about a marriage like the one I had, where the diminishment is so consistent and so incremental that you stop registering it. You adjust. You recalibrate. You decide, over and over in small moments, that the path of least friction is to make yourself smaller, to give less of an opinion, to step back from the table slightly, to filter what you say through the question of whether it will cause a problem. And eventually you do it for so long that you lose the thread of who you were before you started. What I know now is that the self I had calibrated down to was not my actual self. She was a compression of it. Underneath was the person who had analyzed a set of financial statements and written a six-figure check on her own conviction and been right. The person who had read an LLC operating agreement line by line and understood exactly what it gave her and what it didn't. The person who had sat through 7 years of being told, in the gentlest possible ways, that she didn't quite understand how things worked, while quietly, methodically building something real. That person had not gone anywhere. She had just been waiting for the room. I parked in my building's garage and sat for a moment with both hands still on the wheel. I thought about Lavinia and my husband probably talking at that very moment, working through the sequence of the day, looking for the leverage point where they could still find a way to reframe what had happened in a direction that preserved something. I felt no particular satisfaction about that. But I did not feel sorry either. The pearl earrings were still in my pocket. I took them out and held the pouch in my palm under the dim parking garage fluorescence. Small, irreplaceable, exactly where they should be. I put them back and went upstairs. If you've ever been made to feel like the least important person in a room you helped build, then you know exactly what I'm describing. Subscribe, because there are so many more of these stories coming. Every one of them about a woman who stopped making herself smaller and finally took up the space she had always earned.